So hello everyone, welcome to another VFL video. Today we're going to talk about the philosophy behind the rule set of VFL, because I knew that I would get quite a few questions about this in general, so we're just going to take a look at the rules and basically explain why are those the rules, right? Why did I even bother making those rules? Why is it the way that it is? Well, essentially the main two things you need to understand about the rule set of VFL and the reason why I went for this is basically two main pillars, right? One is obviously gameplay balance, right? The game had to be somewhat balanced, if the best solution was just available to everyone and, just pick a bunch of G2 players and pick a bunch of T1 players and, just pick all the best players, then that wouldn't be very fun, would it, right? Because everyone would just do that. So one side was gameplay balance, and the other side was simplicity. And most of the time, pretty much everything in the rules can be answered by one of those two things, but we will still go through them and kind of, talk about why things are the way that they are. So let's start off by talking about the rules, right? So the first thing is selecting your initial squad, right? So you're going to have a team of 11 players. Let's start with that, right? Why 11 players? Because I know I'm going to get quite a few questions about why 11, right? Valorant is played in groups of 5, like, okay, maybe you wanted more than just 5 players to, express the game a bit more. And yeah, that was the first point, right? Like, should there just be 5 players? And initially, that's actually what I started out with. But I quickly realized, like, 5 players isn't enough players, right? Like, you've got so many to choose from if I include all 3 regions of EMEA, Americas, and Pacific, that just choosing 5, felt quite limited in scope. And so I definitely wanted it to be more than 5. But the next question you're probably asking is, why not 10? Right? Why not have 10 players instead of just, 5? Wouldn't 10 work pretty well? Well, the thing is with 10 players, and the reason I didn't want 10 players is because of the way I wanted it to work with a bench. Right? Because I'm an FPL player, and that's Fantasy Premier League, for those of you wondering. And in FPL, you have 11 players, and you bench 4, right? And that's where I was kind of coming from for this game, is that I knew I wanted to have a bench, because often what happens in FPL, and I'm sure will often happen to you in VFL as well, is that you will find yourself benching a player and they actually score, a lot of points. And you're annoyed because I've had that player on my bench and I should have played them instead. And I can't believe I've done this. And it annoys you and it creates an emotion. It creates a feeling and you feel like, oh, why couldn't I just go back in time and change it? And I wanted that feeling to be in the game as well, right? So that's the idea of having a bench to begin with. And the reason why I didn't want 10 players is because if you split 10 players into, a starting lineup and a bench, you're probably going to end up with either 8 players and 2 on the bench, or 7 players and 3 on the bench, right? That's probably what you'll end up with. For 7 players and 3 on the bench, it just felt like too much, right? It felt like there was, not enough. It felt like the ratio was just a bit off there in terms of the amount of starters to bench players. And so I just didn't like that. And then for 8 and 2, it was more so that I felt like that could be abused somewhat. And actually, I did feel like both 7 and 3 and 8 and 2 could be abused in certain ways, right? So, for instance, in a 7-player 3 bench, you could essentially just have, 2, maybe even 3 really, really cheap players and have 7 incredible players. And you just play those 7 the entire time, and they're all like, on top teams, top players, and you essentially just don't change anything, which I thought was a bit dull, right? So that's why not that one. And then for 8 and 2, I thought kind of a similar thing where it might even be too restrictive, right? That you're having to, pick a bunch of mid-tier players. You can't afford to pick any premium players because they cost too much, right? So 8 and 3, it felt better. I can't explain really too much why. It just felt better. It felt like there was potential for a better mix overall, and so that is why I went with 11 players, still keeping it low enough to keep it somewhat simple, but enough to allow you to express your own opinions about the game, whilst also keeping a kind of gameplay balance between the bench and the actual starters. Then let's talk about roles, because initially I wasn't going to have roles in it. Actually, adding the roles was quite a late decision, to be honest, in terms of the rule set. I was pretty set on not having roles, but eventually I decided that I did want roles, just because it again allowed more kind of like expression of choice, right? And especially when I kind of thought of the wildcard idea, I really liked the wildcard idea because it created a variance because I knew with, as we'll come on to later with the scoring system, once I started plugging in like what players were getting in terms of scores at kickoff, I very quickly realized like, oh, the duelists are getting quite a bit more points than everyone else. So by adding wildcards in, that creates an interesting discussion of, well, the duelist players cost more than the, you know, the other roles. So do you want 3 duelists as one of your wildcard? Do you want 4 duelists? Do you want just 2? Right, and a more balanced squad. And I thought that that was quite an interesting dynamic, and so that helped me kind of think like, yeah, roles are good, and also it helps kind of categorize players more into the roles, even if some of the roles do end up being wrong, of course, because teams do change roles, but that is what it is, right? The budget of 100 was kind of set on pretty soon, right? As soon as I knew that I didn't want 5 players, it was very obviously gonna be 100. It's a nice round number. It makes sense. It allowed me to have the average cost of a player be 9.1 when I got to 11, right? Which I thought, yeah, I can make that work. And hopefully I have done. The 2 players per VCT team, again, kind of comes from an FPL idea where you can only have 3 players from any one team. Obviously just adds again to the gameplay balance of not just abusing one team. Made a lot of sense, right? In terms of the bench, we've already been through that, right? Picking the 8 players. The IGL who can score double points, again, is kind of an FPL idea with the captain, right? Gives you more choice, essentially, right? And again, it's kind of going to be a big decision game week to game week. So that's why we went for the IGL. We called it IGL instead of captain, just because it's obviously more familiar language with kind of, you know, esports in general. So yeah, that's why that's the way it is, but that's all pretty simple. Transfers, again, coming from FPL, right? You get 1 free transfer per week. In FPL these days, you can actually save the transfer and get up to 5 free transfers if you don't use any. That's not the way it works here in the Valorant Fantasy League, just because the way at least it's working right now, and who knows, maybe in the future, maybe it will work like that, right? Maybe if somehow we manage to get the game going throughout kickoff all the way through the season, like maybe that is how it will work. I don't know. But at least for now, I thought there's not enough game weeks to really make that worth it, right? And also it could be abused, right? Like if you can save all of your transfers just for that last week, and actually especially with the way EMEA is working this time around, yeah, I just thought that could have been abused a bit too much. So I decided to keep it safe for now, see how it goes with just 1. But in the future, this honestly is something that could change in the future depending on how it goes. Deadlines, again, obviously there has to be a deadline at some point. EMEA absolutely screwed us to kind of pull the curtain, you know, back behind the scenes. I didn't realize that EMEA was starting kind of a week late, essentially, until very late in the process, and that caused a little bit of panic, I'm not gonna lie. EMEA essentially just screwed us. I have no idea why they're starting a week later. Essentially, it isn't actually a full week later, but, you know, for our purposes, it was like, well, EMEA week 1 is gonna overlap with, you know, America's week 2, pretty much, and so there's gonna be no downtime, so that's gonna be pretty tough, right? And EMEA kickoff started before Americas and Pacific, so I was just assuming that was going to be the case for stage 1. It isn't the case for stage 1. It might be for stage 2. I don't know. I hope it is, because then we can just have it be normal. But unfortunately, it is what it is for now. But yeah, that's that. And then the scoring, right? So let's talk about the scoring. And kind of the philosophy behind this, because obviously this is kind of the main thing. Like, why did you go for this kind of scoring system? Because there have been other like fantasy Valorant stuff before, and a lot of people, you know, kept suggesting things to me, like, you know, oh, will you do it like this? Oh, you should do it like this, right? This is where the kind of, you know, second pillar of simplicity comes in. Okay, I think that these rules are pretty simple to understand, right? Like, it doesn't take that long for you to pretty quickly, like, once you kind of are somewhat familiar with the game, you can actually in real time kind of be working out what your player is going to score. And that is what I wanted, right? I wanted it to be simple enough so that as you're actually watching a Valorant game, you can be like, oh, it's the last round, it's round 24, my player is on 21 kills, so they're getting, you know, 3 points for that. They haven't got a 4K, they haven't got an ace, so they're not getting any for that. They've won the first map. Oh, if they win this one, they'll get 4 more points. You know, they'll get 4 points for a 2-0 as well. So that would be 7, right? And, well, this game is going to round 24, so there's no bonus there for getting more than that. And then essentially you could work this out whilst you were watching the game. That is kind of what I wanted for it, with some caveats. Because you could say, well, you know, aren't there some simpler ways of doing that if you really wanted that? We'll get into that in a second. Obviously, the only part that you probably won't be able to work out during the game is what VLR rating they're going to get. I thought that this was a nice way of giving bonus points though, right? I thought that that was, you know, just quite a nice way of like rewarding good performances, and that, you know, it makes sense to kind of have, you know, the best players get rewarded more for doing pretty well. So this you won't be able to work out, but other than that, you know, you will be. The only part that I would say is somewhat complex is obviously like, oh, you've added in here kind of a 2-0 bonus. You've got like extra bonuses for winning by a certain amount of rounds. Like, why is that the case? Well, that's the case because of the way that the kills work, right? Because if you think about it, the average kills for a map is like 15, right? So my thought was, let's have it be +2 as kind of a, and again, this comes back to kind of FPL, right? You get 2 points for playing 60 minutes in FPL, right? So +2 is kind of like your neutral score. And that's kind of what I was going for here, right? The 15 kills in a map, if the map is close, is about a neutral score, right? And I didn't want deaths in there as well, or, you know, KDA or things like that, because people will want stuff to be revolve around that. The reason that those aren't in there is because it's simpler not to have them, right? So deaths and assists aren't involved because it's just simpler to say to not have them, right? And just make it about kills and kills only, because that's very easy to focus on and very simple, right? But the map stuff is in there, so like, you know, you get +1 for winning a map by 5+ rounds, because essentially that limits how many kills you're gonna get, right? Like, if you win 13-7, well, that means you're gonna get less kills, right, than if the game was 13-11. So essentially, the point is that you're getting the extra +1 for winning as a kind of makeup point for the kills that you've lost, right? Or potential kills that you've lost, right? And the same is true. The -1 for a map loss is basically just punishing teams for being bad. But other than that, you know, like winning a map by 10+ rounds, you know, the 2-0 as well, you know, essentially you're getting +2, because if this went to map 3, you would probably get +2 for getting 15 kills on that third map. Assuming that that is a close map, you would probably get 15 kills, right? Because that's our average. So that's where the +2 for winning a 2-0 comes in. Now, you obviously don't get any extra points for losing 2-0 because you don't deserve anything, because you weren't very good, right? But that's why these are kind of the way that they are, is kind of a mix between keeping it as simple as possible, only focusing on kills, but also making up points for potential, you know, losses in kills that they otherwise would have got if this was a closer game. Essentially is kind of the reasoning behind the scoring system here for VFL. And that is kind of, you know, what I went for in mind for this game, right? So it's about simplicity and it's about game balance as well. And those are the kind of two main pillars that I went for when creating the rules, to hopefully keep it fun, keep it interesting. And as I say, hopefully you'll be able to watch a game and have a pretty good idea of whether your player is doing well or not, right? That's kind of the hope. And yeah, hopefully that will make it a pretty fun game going forward that, you know, can be accessible to really, even if you aren't that into Valorant, you could still look at these rules, and as long as you understand the basics of the game, still be able to have a pretty good idea of whether your player is doing well or not. So hopefully that will answer some of the questions that you might have behind some of the rules. Obviously, there are a ton of different ways that you could do this, but essentially this rule set is just a mix of simplicity and gameplay balance, and, you know, essentially relying on myself to be able to cost the players correctly so that it can't be abused.